while people are bringing in their question, Karen and I both have questions on this. If Karen doesn't mind, I'll take first crack. Chris, you talk about the federal budget and all the hard choices that need to be made, and I think we all agree that it needs to be done. But do you think the American people are really ready for a more frugal government at this point?
I mean, I think the short answer, yes. One, if you read all the polls, I mean, people want to get this tackled. People see the problems going on in Europe with the sovereign debt crisis there, and realize you can make some difficult choices now, or you can have those difficult choices forced, and will be much more difficult choices forced upon you by the bond market later on if you don't get your house in order. And so, yes, while this last week we focused pretty much solely on the non-defense discretionary, which does make up only a small part of the budget, you're going to see as the House Republicans move forward and put out their FY12 budget, you're going to see the mandatory spending, the Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, all the entitlements. You're going to see those get addressed. You're going to see specific reforms put forward. Unfortunately, the president and his FY12 budget failed to lead on this issue, failed to address them whatsoever, and so they're still operating under the premise that creating a new multi-trillion-dollar entitlement where you put 32 million people on, give them free, quote-unquote, free health insurance, that somehow saves money. I don't believe anybody in their right mind actually believes that saves money, and so we're actually going to come up with some proposals and propose very specific reforms on the entitlements, ways that you can begin to help save these entitlements for future generations. And so that you're going to see that continue as we finish up the FY11 budget, and we have the debt ceiling vote, and then we have the FY12 budget. So this is going to be constantly going on, and the Republicans in the House are going to lead where the president, frankly, hasn't.
Chris, another thank you. First, I want to thank, it's Karen, I want to thank you for a really, really wonderful overview, and I can tell you I learned a lot from listening to your insights and experiences, and as I always do when I speak to Chris. But I do want to ask you about the budget as well. And we basically have the president submitting a $3.76 trillion budget. The Republicans have just requested a $100 billion cut from that budget, which, you know, my estimation, it comes out to about a 2.6, 2.7% cut overall of the budget. Why, yet when we look through specific proposals for cuts, they often seem to be politically motivated, for better or worse, and you know, there's huge cuts to women, infants, and children's nutrition programs, 30% cut. Why not just across the board 2.7% cut and make it clean, make it easy? That doesn't seem, and move on to getting jobs for people.
Very good question. Well, one, on the president's budget, you heard Chairman Ryan say it's DOA, right? Debt on arrival. I thought that was pretty catchy. But in terms of the specific cuts versus across the board, so one, I mean, you can look at, I mean, it's interesting. Anybody who thinks these are draconian cuts that are being made, and it gets characterized that way in the media quite a bit, as these are draconian cuts getting made, when we're simply trying to cut spending levels back to 2008. And I was here in 2006, and I recollect that a lot of reasons Republicans got voted out in 2006 was because we spent too much money. So now to say we're going back to 2008, where Congressman Garrett thought those levels were too high, and I think the American public probably thought they were too high, to say we're now draconianly cutting the budget back to 08 levels, where everyone thought they were too high then, it just kind of is funny to me. But in terms of the direct cuts, or as opposed to across the board, one, I don't know how if the cuts, the increases in all the programs weren't increased across the board. So maybe some programs got increased more than others, and so maybe they need to be decreased more than others because they received a bigger increase. Obviously, each member has their own different priorities and where spending goes. Some congressmen may feel it's more important to have more money for border security, the ones that live in some of the border areas. Others might feel that we need more money for Homeland Security, especially they live in the New York City area. And so while you can cut across the board to help kind of ease the pain, if you will, still each member has, Congress is going to have their priorities, and I think you saw that play out during this past week. You know, as we discussed, the Lotterette had an amendment to cut across the board, and I think he wound up pulling that amendment at the end. You have 600 different amendments where different members are trying to move funding around because everyone's got priorities. And I think ultimately, at the end of the day, if you let the 435 members work their will, then you come to a place where everyone's kind of, you know, more comfortable with in terms of the overall cuts. But you're right, some do get cut more than others. EPA got cut a lot more because it got a larger increase, to be quite frank, during the budget increases. So.
All right, Chris, we do have an audience question, if that's okay.
Sure.
The question is, how do you and/or the congressman, I guess both or either, if you're speaking for him, how do you expect those who rely on entitlements to survive, exist on less and less while the cost of living continues to go up?
Very good question. Well, one, let's make sure that we're laying out specifically the reform proposals to the entitlements that have been suggested by Chairman Ryan and others don't touch anyone who is currently 55 or older. So that's an important facet to mention. So they're not touching anybody currently on retirement. So if you're currently relying on Social Security or Medicare, then you aren't having any cuts, and the cost of living, yes, is continuing to go up. Actually, the cost of living didn't go up last year. That's why the cost of living increase didn't get included on Social Security. But that's an important dynamic to mention. Two, if you don't reform the programs right now, if you don't do something to reform the way these entitlements are done, then they're not going to be there. They're not going to be there for anybody's children, for the next generation to have. I myself, I'm 32 years old right now, and because I handle, because I work here in Washington and I keep an eye on our kind of state of affairs, I know they're bad, and I'm not planning on doing any. I'm not planning on having Social Security there for me or Medicare there for me. I'm trying to save up to the extent that I can right now, because I don't think that, you know, I'm always concerned that we're not going to have these programs around if we don't do these reforms. So, like I said, you either take a little bit of the medicine now, or you get the medicine forced on you later. But we're on a current unsustainable path where mandatory spending will eat up 100% of the budget by 2037. And if we don't want a Defense Department, if we don't want a Department of Education, if we don't want any EPA, if we don't want any of these other things the government's involved with, then we can keep the entitlements growing on their current unsustainable path. But we have to do something to rein them in.
Okay, we have no more audience questions on that particular subject. So why don't we go ahead and move us into the question section for housing markets. The first question that we have from the audience is, you talk about the government's exposure to the housing market. Does the subcommittee have any idea how big that is?
How big the exposure to the housing market is? Well, right now, at least, with Fannie and Freddie and FHA underwriting about 95% of the mortgage markets, I guess it's about 95% of the new origination we have 100% backing on. So that's, I think everyone agrees that the Treasury Secretary, even Ranking Member Frank, and everyone agrees that having the government underwrite 95% of our mortgage market, as it currently is doing, is completely unsustainable. Before the financial crisis really hit, FHA's market share was 3%. The Federal Housing Administration's market share was 3% of new originations. In 2010, the Federal Housing Administration, which had a 3% market share in 2005, was originating 50% of new mortgages. 50% of all new mortgages getting written were being financed through the FHA. And that, it's a small agency. It does not have the ability to keep up with that. It does not have the technological capacity to be able to handle all that. And to keep that running at that is going to put a lot of onus on the taxpayers. So we have to get private capital back into mortgage markets